Hello, and welcome back to Crimson Chronicles. It's so great to have you with us again. Before we get into today's chilling narrative, I want to give a massive shout out to our amazing community. Your comments and theories on our last case were incredible. If this is your first time here, we delve into the most compelling and often heartbreaking stories from the shadowy side of human nature. To make sure you don't miss our weekly explorations into the darkness, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. You won't regret it. Now, let's prepare for the story we're here to tell. I must state clearly that the following account is a work of fiction. All characters, names, events, and institutions portrayed in this narrative are entirely the product of the imagination. Any resemblance to actual events or persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This story deals with mature themes and may be disturbing for some viewers. We often think of a wedding day as the ultimate beginning, a celebration of love, trust, and a shared future. But for one bride, it was the beginning of the end. Today, we unravel the horrific crime of a groom who turned a sacred vow into a death sentence, all for the allure of a $1 billion dowry. This is the story of how a fairy tale wedding became a waking nightmare. The love story of Isabella de la Cruz and Julian Croft was, by all public accounts, a modern fairy tale. It was the kind of story that graced the glossy pages of high society magazines and fueled the aspirational dreams of millions. Isabella was not just wealthy. She was the sole heiress to the de la Cruz empire, a global conglomerate with interests in everything from pharmaceuticals to sustainable energy. She was the luminous sun around which a galaxy of fortune orbited. But beyond the staggering numbers attached to her name, Isabella was a woman of genuine warmth and profound kindness. She had her father's business acumen but her mother's compassionate heart, a combination that made her both respected in the boardroom and beloved in the philanthropic circles she frequented. Her beauty was of a classic, understated sword eyes, the color of warm honey that held a hint of vulnerability, and a smile that could disarm the most cynical of corporate raiders. Julian Croft, by contrast, was a man who had built himself from the ground up, or so the story went. He was devastatingly handsome, with a chiseled jaw, piercing blue eyes, and a charisma that seemed to radiate from him like a physical force. He was an investment banker, a rising star at a prestigious firm, known for his aggressive strategies and an uncanny ability to close impossible deals. He moved through the world with an air of effortless confidence, his tailored suits and expensive watches the armor of a man who had conquered the concrete jungle. When he and Isabella met at a charity gala, the connection was electric, a seemingly perfect fusion of old money and new ambition. To the outside world, Julian was the ultimate prize for a woman who could have anyone. He was attentive, doting, and fiercely protective of Isabella. He seemed not only unintimidated by her wealth but also genuinely in love with the woman herself, celebrating her intelligence and her spirit. He learned her favorite flowers were stargazer lilies, not roses. He remembered the name of her childhood dog. He listened, with what appeared to be rapt attention, to her passionate monologues about oceanic conservation. He was, in every conceivable way, the perfect partner. But a facade, no matter how exquisitely constructed, is still just a facade. The Julian Croft the world saw was a masterpiece of social engineering, a character he had been crafting his entire life. The reality was a man hollowed out by a gnawing, insatiable greed and a crippling fear of mediocrity. His self-made narrative was a carefully curated fiction. He came from a middle-class background, but his ambition was a ravenous beast. He had climbed the corporate ladder not just through talent, but through a ruthless willingness to step on anyone who stood in his way. And for all his outward success, he was drowning. A series of high-risk, off-the-books investments had backfired spectacularly, leaving him in a chasm of debt so deep that it threatened to swallow his entire career and reputation. He owed dangerous people an astronomical sum of money, and their patience was wearing thin. When Julian met Isabella, he didn't see a soulmate. He saw a lifeline. He saw a golden, shimmering solution to all his problems. The courtship was a calculated campaign. Every loving glance, every whispered sweet nothing, Every thoughtful gesture was a strategic move in the most important hostile takeover of his life. He studied her, learned her weaknesses, her desires, her dreams, and then mirrored them back to her, becoming the man she had always unknowingly wished for. And he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Isabella, who had been so guarded, so wary of fortune hunters, fell for him completely and irrevocably. The linchpin of Julian's plan was the de la Cruz family tradition, the dowry. It was an archaic custom, but one that Isabella's father, a staunch traditionalist, had insisted upon. On her wedding day, a trust of $1 billion would be established. Upon the signing of the marriage certificate, the trust would become active, with Isabella as the primary beneficiary. However, the trust's bylaws, drafted by generations of shrewd de la Cruz lawyers, contained a specific and crucial clause. In the event of Isabella's death, the full sum would pass to her surviving spouse. It was a clause designed to ensure the financial security of the man who would care for his daughter. In Julian's mind, it was not a safety net. It was a target. The wedding preparations were a spectacle of opulence. The venue was a historic Italian villa overlooking Lake Como, rented for an entire month. The guest list was a who's who of global finance, politics, and royalty. The world's most famous floral designer was flown in to transform the villa into a veritable Eden. Isabella's dress was a custom-made creation by a Parisian couturier, hand-stitched with thousands of seed pearls. The cost of the wedding alone could have funded a small nation for a year. Isabella was blissfully, radiantly happy. She floated through the endless meetings with wedding planners and caterers, her spirit buoyed by the prospect of spending the rest of her life with the man she adored. She saw the stress of the preparations as a joyful whirlwind, a prelude to the quiet, happy life she envisioned with Julian. She was blind to the subtle signs that something was amiss. She didn't notice the way Julian's smile never quite reached his eyes during meetings with the lawyers finalizing the dowry trust. She dismissed his increasing preoccupation and irritability as pre-wedding jitters. When he insisted on a small, private honeymoon at a remote, secluded chalet in the Swiss Alps that he had discovered, she saw it as a wonderfully romantic gesture, a desire for them to be truly alone after the grand spectacle of their wedding. She didn't see it for what it was, the selection of a stage. Julian, meanwhile, was living on a razor's edge. The pressure was immense. His creditors were becoming more aggressive, their veiled threats turning into explicit warnings. He had to maintain the illusion of the loving fiancé, a role that was becoming increasingly taxing as his desperation grew. He played the part to perfection, a consummate actor in the final act of his greatest performance. He held Isabella's hand, looked deep into her trusting eyes, and spoke of their future, of the children they would have, of the life they would build together, all while a cold, calculating part of his brain was meticulously planning her death. He researched endlessly, late into the night, after Isabella had fallen asleep beside him. He studied remote locations, weather patterns, and, most importantly, methods of murder that could be convincingly staged as accidents. He settled on the chalet in the Alps. It was isolated, perched on the edge of a treacherous mountain pass that was known for its sudden, violent storms and dangerous, icy patches, even in the late spring. It was the perfect location for a tragic, unavoidable accident. The week before the wedding was a blur of final preparations and social obligations. At their rehearsal dinner, a lavish affair on a yacht navigating the shimmering waters of Lake Como, Julian gave a speech that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. He spoke of Isabella as his guiding star, his anchor, his reason for being. He raised his glass, his voice thick with what everyone believed was genuine emotion. "To Isabella," he proclaimed, his gaze locked on his bride. "My love, my life, my everything. I was a man lost at sea, and you, my darling, are my shore. May our life together be as beautiful and as endless as this lake." Isabella wept with joy, her heart so full of love she felt it might burst. She was completely, utterly deceived. She looked at the handsome, charismatic man before her and saw her future. Julian looked at her and saw $1 billion. He saw his escape. He saw an obstacle that would soon be removed. The wedding day dawned, a perfect Italian morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air scented with jasmine and gardenias. Isabella was a vision, her happiness so palpable it seemed to light up the room. As her father walked her down the aisle, a path strewn with white rose petals, every eye was on her. But Isabella only had eyes for Julian, who stood at the altar, a look of pure adoration on his face. It was his greatest performance. He watched her approach, a goddess in white, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, a sliver of genuine emotion pierced his armor of greed. He saw her beauty, her innocence, her absolute, unconditional love for him. He saw the life he could have, a life of genuine happiness and companionship. It was a life he was about to burn to the ground. He ruthlessly suppressed the feeling, crushing it under the weight of his debt and the dazzling allure of the billion-dollar prize. He reminded himself of the threats, the fear, the humiliation of his impending ruin. This was not a choice. It was a necessity. They exchanged their vows, their voices clear and steady in the warm Italian air. When Julian slid the diamond-encrusted band onto Isabella's finger, his touch was as gentle as a whisper, his smile as warm as the sun. "With this ring, I thee wed," he murmured, his blue eyes looking directly into her soul. "And with this ring, I thee wed," she replied, her voice trembling with happiness. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. Julian leaned in and kissed his bride. The kiss was long and passionate, and the guests erupted in applause. It was a picture-perfect moment, a scene of pure, unadulterated joy. But as he held his new wife in his arms, his mind was a world away, in the cold, thin air of the Swiss Alps. The performance was over. The planning was complete. The horrific crime he had envisioned for so long was now just one short honeymoon away. The fairy tale had reached its final page, and a horror story was about to begin. The transition from the sun-drenched shores of Lake Como to the stark, majestic beauty of the Swiss Alps was as abrupt as the shift in Julian's demeanor. The grand, public spectacle of the wedding was over, and with it, the need for his constant, high-wattage performance. The secluded chalet, named Adlerhorst or Eagle's Nest, was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a glass and timber structure cantilevered over a dramatic, vertiginous cliff edge. It offered breathtaking panoramic views of snow-capped peaks and verdant valleys, a landscape of sublime and intimidating isolation. It was, as Julian had planned, utterly remote. The nearest village was a 30-minute drive down a treacherous, winding mountain road. There was no cell service, only a spotty satellite internet connection. They were, for all intents and purposes, completely alone. For Isabella, this was the romantic paradise she had dreamed of. She was enchanted by the chalet's beauty and the profound silence of the mountains, a silence broken only by the sighing of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. She saw their isolation not as a threat, but as an opportunity to truly connect with her new husband, away from the prying eyes of the world and the demands of their public lives. She unpacked their things, her heart light and full of hope, blissfully unaware that she was arranging her belongings in what was intended to be her tomb. In the first few days of their honeymoon, Julian maintained a convincing semblance of the doting husband. They hiked scenic trails, shared champagne in the outdoor hot tub overlooking the abyss, and made love by the warmth of a roaring fire. Yet, for the first time, Isabella began to notice small, discordant notes in his behavior. There was a new stillness about him, an unnerving watchfulness. His smiles, which had once seemed so spontaneous and warm, now felt practiced and fleeting. He would often fall silent in the middle of a conversation, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his blue eyes turning cold and remote, like chips of glacial ice. Once, as they stood on the chalet's expansive balcony, a sheer drop of thousands of feet just beyond the glass railing, Isabella had leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "It's so beautiful here, Julian. I feel like we're the only two people in the world." "We are," he had replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. His arms, which were wrapped around her, did not feel like a loving embrace, but like a cage. A shiver, unrelated to the crisp mountain air, had traced its way down her spine. She had turned to look at him, but his mask of affection was already back in place, and he had kissed her, chasing the fleeting sense of unease away. She dismissed it, as she had dismissed the other small oddities, as a product of her own imagination, a post-wedding come-down after months of intense planning and excitement. Her love for him was a blinding sun, and she was incapable of seeing the dark spots on its surface. Julian, meanwhile, was a coiled spring of tension and anticipation. Every moment was a calculation. He was waiting for the perfect confluence of circumstances. The right weather, the right time, the right opportunity. He spent hours surreptitiously studying the weather reports on the chalet's satellite internet, looking for the forecast of a sudden, severe storm. He meticulously wiped his fingerprints from any surface he touched that might be considered unusual, and he rehearsed his story, the narrative of the tragic accident, over and over in his mind until it felt like a memory. His internal state was a chaotic storm of its own. The proximity to the billion-dollar prize made his greed sharper, more urgent. But the proximity to Isabella, to her unwavering trust and genuine love, was an unexpected complication. Her kindness, her laughter, her gentle touch, they were like tiny cracks appearing in the frozen surface of his resolve. He found himself lashing out at her over small, insignificant things, a misplaced book, a question he found annoying. These flashes of cruelty were brief, but they startled Isabella and, in a strange way, they startled him too. It was the frantic effort of his darker nature to reassert control, to beat back the unwelcome glimmers of conscience that threatened to derail his meticulous plan. On the 5th day of their honeymoon, the perfect storm arrived. The morning had been deceptively clear, but by the afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised, ominous purple. The wind began to howl, a mournful, banshee-like shriek that rattled the chalet's floor-to-ceiling windows. A cold, driving rain began to fall, quickly turning to sleet and then to snow, a late spring blizzard that was not uncommon at these altitudes but was severe nonetheless. The temperature plummeted. The mountain pass, their only link to civilization, would be impassable. This was it. The moment Julian had been waiting for. The stage was set. He feigned a calm nonchalance, suggesting they build a fire and open a special bottle of wine he had brought. He chose a powerful sedative from the small, hidden kit he had assembled. It was odorless, tasteless, and fast-acting. He poured 2 glasses of the expensive Bordeaux, and as he turned his back to Isabella to retrieve a log for the fire, he emptied the contents of a small vial into her glass. He handed her the glass, his hand perfectly steady. "To us, my love," he said, his voice a soft, intimate murmur. "To the beginning of forever." "To forever," she echoed, her honey-colored eyes shining with love. She took a deep sip of the wine. They sat by the fire, the storm raging outside creating a false sense of cozy intimacy within. Julian steered the conversation to their future, encouraging Isabella to talk about her dreams, her plans for the De La Cruz Foundation, the family she hoped they would have. He watched her, a predator observing its prey, as the drug began to take effect. Her speech began to slur slightly, her movements became languid, and a pleasant, drowsy confusion clouded her eyes. "I feel so sleepy," she murmured, her head resting on his shoulder. "Must be the wine. And this fire." "Just relax, my love," Julian whispered, his voice a venomous caress. "Close your eyes." She did, her breathing becoming deep and even. She was not unconscious, but deeply sedated, pliant and disoriented. Now was the time. With a strength born of adrenaline and cold-blooded resolve, he lifted her into his arms. She stirred slightly, a soft, questioning sound escaping her lips, but she was too groggy to resist. He carried her out onto the balcony. The wind tore at them, a furious, physical assault. The snow was falling thick and fast, a blinding white curtain that erased the line between the balcony and the abyss beyond. The cold was brutal, a sharp, biting pain. He set her down near the glass railing, her body slumping against it. This was the most critical part of his plan. He had to make it look like an accident. A fall. He had previously and discreetly tampered with the latch on the gate section of the glass railing, weakening it so that it would give way under pressure. Isabella's eyes fluttered open. The shock of the cold and the howling wind seemed to cut through the fog of the sedative for a brief, lucid moment. She looked around, confused. She saw the swirling snow, the terrifying emptiness beyond the railing. And then she looked at Julian. In that instant, she saw him. She truly saw him for the first time. The mask was gone. In its place was a face she did not recognize. A face of cold, hard calculation. A face devoid of any love, any warmth, any humanity. There was no rage, no passion, just a chilling, empty resolve. The truth, in all its horrific, unimaginable entirety, crashed down upon her. "Julian?" she whispered, her voice a fragile wisp of sound snatched away by the wind. It was not a question of confusion, but of dawning, soul-shattering horror. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hands on her shoulders. Her eyes widened, a universe of betrayal, love, and terror swirling in their depths. She understood. She finally, truly understood. The man she had given her heart to, her life to, was about to take it. She tried to struggle, but the drug had sapped her strength. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. A single tear froze on her cheek. He pushed. It didn't take much force. He pushed her against the weakened gate of the railing. With a sickening crack of metal and a shatter of tempered glass, the gate gave way. For a heart-stopping moment, she hung on the precipice, suspended between the world of the living and the cold, empty abyss. Her eyes were locked on his, a final silent scream of why, and then she was gone, swallowed by the snow and the wind and the darkness. Julian stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, the wind whipping his hair across his face. He felt nothing. No remorse, no sadness, no guilt. Only a profound, exhilarating sense of release. He was free. The debt was gone. The $1 billion was his. He stepped back inside, closing the door on the storm and the crime. His movements were precise, methodical. He took Isabella's wine glass to the kitchen and washed it, along with his own. He took the wine bottle and the 2 glasses and carefully smashed them on the stone floor near the balcony door, as if they had been dropped in a moment of panic and shock. He then took a heavy fireplace poker and delivered a single, powerful blow to his own forehead, just enough to cause a nasty, bleeding gash and a significant bruise. The pain was sharp, but it was a necessary part of the performance. He then waited. He waited for what he calculated to be a believable amount of time for a man to recover from a blow to the head and the shock of witnessing his wife's accidental death. He mussed his hair, tore his shirt, and worked himself into a state of hysterical, theatrical grief. Finally, he stumbled to the chalet's emergency satellite phone. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number for the local authorities. "Help me. Please, help me," he screamed into the phone, his voice a perfect symphony of panic and despair. "My wife. There's been an accident. A terrible accident. She fell. Oh God. She fell from the balcony. Please. You have to help her." He played the part of the grieving widower with an actor's precision. He was Julian Croft, the heartbroken groom, a man whose fairy tale had ended in the most tragic way imaginable. He had just committed the perfect murder, or so he believed. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, Julian Croft's performance was flawless. When the mountain rescue team and local police finally reached the isolated chalet the next morning, the storm having passed, they found a scene of apparent tragedy. They found a man who appeared to be in the throes of profound shock and grief. He was disheveled, with a convincing head wound, and his story was delivered with a heart-wrenching, albeit slightly incoherent, panic that seemed entirely genuine. He told them a story that was simple, plausible, and utterly tragic. He and Isabella had been drinking wine, celebrating their honeymoon. They had stepped out onto the balcony for a moment to watch the dramatic storm, a foolish, romantic impulse. A powerful gust of wind had caught Isabella off balance. He had lunged for her, but in his haste, he had slipped on a patch of ice, hitting his head on the stone floor and knocking himself momentarily unconscious. When he came to, she was gone. The broken railing and the shattered wine glasses seemed to corroborate his account perfectly. The recovery of Isabella's body from the base of the cliff seemed to seal the tragic narrative. The fall was catastrophic, the cause of death unambiguous. The initial assessment from the local coroner was accidental death due to a fall from a significant height, with contributing factors of inclement weather and possible intoxication. The Swiss authorities, accustomed to the inherent dangers of their alpine landscape, were initially inclined to accept the story at face value. It was a terrible, tragic accident, but an accident nonetheless. Julian returned to New York a grieving hero, a figure of immense public sympathy. The media portrayed him as the tragic prince of a fairy tale cut short. He played the part of the inconsolable widower to perfection. He was photographed looking gaunt and haunted at Isabella's lavish funeral, his head bowed, his face a mask of sorrow. He gave a tearful, moving eulogy, speaking of a love that was too perfect for this world. He was a pillar of tormented grace, and the world mourned with him. Behind the scenes, however, the gears of a different narrative were beginning to turn. The de la Cruz family, while publicly accepting of the initial findings, had their own team of private investigators. More importantly, the case had attracted the attention of Detective Inspector Arnaud Dubois of the Cantonal Police, a veteran investigator with a reputation for a methodical mind and a deep-seated skepticism of stories that were too neat. Dubois was not a man to be swayed by emotional performances. He dealt in facts, in evidence, and in the subtle, often overlooked, inconsistencies of human behavior. Several things bothered Dubois from the start. The first was the railing. While it was broken, the nature of the break seemed more forceful, more direct, than what would be expected from a simple stumble. The second was Julian's head injury. It was suspiciously clean, a single, localized point of impact. In a genuine fall, he would have expected more scrapes, more chaotic bruising. But what bothered Dubois the most was Julian Croft himself. During his initial interview, conducted at the chalet, Dubois had noted that for a man who had just witnessed the death of his wife, Julian had been remarkably lucid in the details he chose to provide, yet conveniently vague in others. His grief, to Dubois's experienced eye, felt rehearsed. It was loud and demonstrative, but it lacked the hollow, disorienting core of genuine trauma. While Julian was busy orchestrating his public mourning in New York, Dubois's team was meticulously combing through the chalet. They found something small, something Julian, in his arrogance, had overlooked. Tucked deep into the fibers of the plush living room carpet, near the fireplace, was a single unused empty pharmaceutical vial. It was tiny, almost insignificant, but it was sent to the lab for analysis. Meanwhile, Julian's lawyers were moving swiftly. Within weeks of Isabella's death, they had executed the clause in the Dowry Trust. The $1 billion fortune was transferred, in its entirety, into accounts controlled solely by Julian Croft. His first move was to pay off his massive debts, silencing his creditors with wire transfers that were staggering in their size. The immediate threat to his life and career was eliminated. He was, for the first time in years, financially solvent. In fact, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And then the spending began. At first, it was subtle. A new penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, a rare vintage sports car. But soon, the pretense of grief began to fray at the edges, and the sheer, unadulterated greed that had driven him to murder began to surface. He threw lavish, decadent parties, his penthouse becoming a notorious hub of hedonism. He bought a yacht, a private jet, and a portfolio of extravagant, often foolish investments. The image of the grieving widower was rapidly being replaced by that of a reckless, profligate playboy. The public sympathy began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease and suspicion. The psychological toll of his crime also began to manifest. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were haunted by Isabella's face, her eyes in that final, terrible moment on the balcony, the moment of perfect, soul-crushing understanding. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown the ghost that followed him everywhere. The $1 billion had bought him freedom from debt, but it had imprisoned him in a gilded cage of his own making, a cage he shared with the specter of his dead wife. His paranoia grew. He saw accusation in every glance. He heard whispers in every quiet room. The man who had been the master of control was losing it. Back in Switzerland, Detective Dubois had his breakthrough. The lab results from the tiny vial came back. It had contained traces of a potent, fast-acting benzodiazepine, a sedative powerful enough to incapacitate an individual quickly and effectively. The coroner was instructed to re-examine Isabella's toxicology reports. The initial screening had been for alcohol and common narcotics. When they tested specifically for the sedative, they found it. There were significant traces in her system, enough to have rendered her severely disoriented and physically helpless. Suddenly, the narrative of a tragic accident crumbled, replaced by the certainty of a cold-blooded murder. The convenient head injury, the broken railing, the sudden storm, it all clicked into place as a meticulously staged crime scene. Dubois now had his evidence. He began digging into Julian Croft's life, and what he found was a mountain of motive. Through international police cooperation, he uncovered the truth of Julian's financial situation before the wedding. The crushing debt, the failed investments, the desperate scramble for capital. And then he found the billion-dollar dowry, the ultimate motive. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. One of Julian's former associates, a man Julian had betrayed in a business deal years prior, came forward. He had been contacted by Julian a few months before the wedding with a strange, hypothetical question about untraceable sedatives. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. But now, seeing Julian's callous and extravagant behavior after Isabella's death, the conversation took on a sinister new meaning. His testimony provided a crucial link showing premeditation. With a mountain of forensic and circumstantial evidence, and an airtight international arrest warrant, the net began to close around Julian Croft. The arrest came not with a dramatic showdown, but with a quiet, almost anticlimactic finality. Julian was at a high-stakes poker game in his penthouse, surrounded by the sycophants and hangers-on his new wealth had attracted. He was drunk, arrogant, and losing badly. When the detectives from the NYPD, accompanied by Dubois, entered the room, the party fell silent. Julian looked up, a confused, drunken sneer on his face. "This is a private party," he slurred. "Julian Croft," Dubois said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the haze of alcohol and cigar smoke. "I am Detective Inspector Arnaud Dubois. I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of your wife, Isabella de la Cruz." For a moment, Julian just stared. And then, the facade that he had so carefully constructed for so long, the mask of the charmer, the lover, the grieving widower, completely shattered. It was not a gradual cracking, but an instantaneous implosion. The color drained from his face, replaced by a waxy, terrified pallor. The arrogant sneer dissolved into a slack-jawed expression of pure, animalistic fear. The devil had finally come to collect his due. The trial was an international media sensation. The prosecution, led by Dubois, laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the evidence of the sedative, the financial motive, the tampered railing, the testimony of the former associate. Julian's defense team tried to argue that Isabella was depressed and had taken her own life, but her friends, family, and a mountain of digital evidence painted a portrait of a joyful, optimistic woman who was deeply in love and excited for her future. Julian himself was a shadow of his former self. The charismatic, confident man was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, haunted figure. He sat in the courtroom, his expensive suit hanging off his now gaunt frame, his eyes vacant. He was a man already serving a life sentence in his own mind. The jury's deliberation was short. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. As he was led away in handcuffs, his billion-dollar empire already being dismantled by lawyers and frozen by the courts, Julian Croft was nothing. He had sacrificed his soul for a fortune he could not keep, and in doing so had lost everything. The fairy tale was over. The horror story had reached its just conclusion. The groom who had become a murderer had taken his bride's life, but in the end, he had only truly destroyed his own.